Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club Westpac Address. My name is Emma MacDonald. I'm the Canberra convener of Women in Media and the Associate Editor of Her Canberra. Today's speaker is Hannah Ferguson, 26-year-old CEO of Cheek Media, podcaster, author and a social media influencer whose political commentary drew her an online audience of more than 4 million people during the recent election campaign. She will unpack the role that she and other influencers played in shaking up our political coverage and how she cut through to Gen Z. If you would like to join the conversation online, please use the handle @PressClubAust and our hashtag is MPC. Now, can I have a round of applause for Hannah Ferguson?
Thank you for your introduction and welcome, Emma. Before I begin today, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. After the disturbing national conversation we've seen in the past few weeks, it's never been more important to recognise and pay respect to the enduring connection that First Nations people have to this country. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to thank the National Press Club for providing me the opportunity to speak here today. It's incredibly meaningful as a member of Generation Z to see the Press Club so willing to welcome a new voice to give a post-election address. I want to particularly thank Emma MacDonald and Women in Media for helping me to secure this opportunity because the gravity of it is not lost on me. Now, at the age of 10, I decided incredibly naively that I wanted to be the Prime Minister of this country. I chose this career path like any other 10-year-old on my first trip to Canberra on a school excursion in grade 4. Shockingly, sitting in the House of Representatives watching our country's leaders hurl insults at each other during question time is not what drew me to want the top job. It was actually during our brief stop at the Australian Electoral Commission. I know I am fun at parties, I promise. During the tour, the system of preferential voting was explained to me. The concept that every person had a vote and an equal voice within that vote was impactful. I hadn't even encountered the work of Anthony Green yet. The sight of a Senate ballot was enough to make me as excited as I was when I saw the sight of Annabelle Crabb's leather tie on election night. Much to the embarrassment of my parents, from that moment forward, I wanted to understand the system we existed within and to improve it. And while I have different aspirations now, it still rings true. I grew up in a middle-class household and was the first in my family to attend university. I spent my childhood between southwestern Sydney and in the regional town of Orange, New South Wales. To say these areas were conservative and that my worldview was as a result is an understatement. When I was accepted to study law at university, it was not because I got the required 99 ATAR, but because the University of Queensland saw a family context that included apprehended violence court orders. Backed by the sturdy support of multiple scholarships, I was able to pursue and prioritise my education. I wanted to enact change both at a personal level and for the broader community I lived in. The experience I had, I hope, resonates with many as a common vision for Australian progress. We want better for the next generation. After commencing my law degree, I was destabilised by those who made up my lecture theatres. My classrooms were filled with elite, privately educated young adults who were more concerned with which school you went to and whether your father was a barrister or an investment banker than who you were as a person. This corner of the world was made up of wealthy white kids who would go on to make the rules that governed our most vulnerable. Decision makers with narrow worldviews and painfully long LinkedIn posts. From the first week of my degree, I knew I would never climb any corporate ladder in this world. Just after my 20th birthday, I applied to do pro bono work at a community legal centre that assisted prisoners. And for a short time, I visited maximum security jails and met with imprisoned men who could not read or write, many of whom could have been on parole, but didn't have access to basic legal support or even awareness as to where to seek this out. I spoke with pregnant women who were due to give birth any day and were subjected to long stretches of time in solitary confinement. Most, if not all of these prisoners had been in and out of incarceration since their teens. Continuing along this path, I then moved to work in public prosecutions, transcribing police interviews with victims and accused perpetrators. By the age of 21, I had seen and heard things no human should ever have to experience. At a personal level, I saw how our justice system fails people on all sides. Upon finishing my degree, I landed my dream role as an industrial officer at the Electrical Trades Union Queensland and Northern Territory. There I learned that one of my greatest strengths was in communicating the law simply. There is no better way to train that muscle than with a membership base of predominantly 50-year-old electricians who wanted and needed to understand their rights at work. While I'm young and my experiences are therefore limited, they are deeply political. It's important to lay this foundation and be forthcoming about my partisan views. To me, human rights and fair pay are not radical ideals. These formative experiences helped to lay the groundwork for the company that I run today. I knew how to communicate complex legal and political ideas in simple and engaging ways. I had the skill set to explain and then challenge the establishment. I looked at the media I was consuming and realised how inaccessible and right-leaning it tended towards. Youth publications failed to take the views of young people seriously. Memes and satire are fun, sure, they serve a cultural role in engagement through entertainment. I do a lot of it. But if there are only options as young people, our political capacity becomes minimised and the scope of our future vision is subsequently diminished. As I stepped out of my small-town upbringing and into these realisations, I increasingly wanted to learn from the people around me about progressive movements. I wanted to create and to facilitate a space that 16-year-old me would have benefited from, then and into my future. I wanted to publish commentary and create room for people to be curious. One of my greatest fears when entering left-wing spaces was feeling like I didn't have a handle on the terminology, the scholarship, the academia. I was terrified to make a mistake and be removed from the community I desperately sought entry into. As I learnt, I wanted to help people and bring them along with me. Out of these desires, along with my co-founders, we created Cheek Media Co. The goal of Cheek has always remained the same: to provide progressive, independent commentary and offer the antidote to the Murdoch chokehold that Australia has been subjected to for decades. In 2020, it was an Instagram account with 120 followers. It was very embarrassing for my family and friends, I'm sure. Fast forward to May 2025, and in the 7 days leading to the federal election, Cheek content was viewed almost 20 million times on Instagram by 4 million Australians. I am not a journalist, and I have never claimed to be. I never will. Research tells us that more than half of Australians get their news on social media, but I don't ever want to be seen as a source of breaking headlines. My intention is to provide opinions, distribute ideas, and ask people to navigate their own moral compass in relation to mine. I don't seek agreement. I want to develop media literacy and encourage people to expand their news diet. The difference between the Murdoch media and many new commentators is that we speak across to people, not down to them. We also have our own challenges, like an entirely new feedback loop of comment sections and direct messages where personalised trolling is the norm, without the barriers or protections of a masthead for whom we're producing work. For many of us, we are here to help people navigate uncomfortable conversations and point out the realities that many of the dinosaurs of legacy media are actively trying to conceal. The fourth estate has failed us because it's currently wedded to the coalition. Our democracy requires a range of diverse voices to help repair what we've lost. It isn't all negative, though. It's crucial to recognise that the best journalism in this country is done by some heavy lifting independent outlets, many of whom rely on donations, subscriptions, and often paywalls to survive. Crikey, The Guardian, Michael West, Z-Feed, Missing Perspectives, The Saturday Paper, The Daily Oz are all incredible contributors to the industry. Social media commentators like myself benefit from the hard work of these journalists. However, without reach, without support, without accessibility, we cannot consider our media landscape to be truly diverse. In late 2024, a report produced by the Australian team of the Global Media and Internet Research Project found that our country had the second highest media concentration in the world when looking at tracking between 2019 and 2022 across 15 markets. Our newspaper sector is owned by 4 companies who own 84% and control of the market share. 3 entities, News Corp, Nine Entertainment and Southern Cross Austereo, control almost 90% of metro radio licences. In Brisbane, Hobart, Darwin and Adelaide, there is 1 daily physical masthead, all owned by News Corp. Instead of counteracting this with a well-funded and thriving national public broadcaster, successive coalition governments over the course of a decade cut $1 billion in funding from the ABC. When Peter Dutton is describing outlets that offer any criticism of him as hate media, you can understand what drives them to do this. The Murdoch media presents a departure from our reality. While a national housing crisis sees homelessness rise, our mastheads interview landlords to see how they're coping. Male shock jocks like Alan Jones, Steve Price and Andrew Bolt are allocated endless space and airtime to falsely and ironically claim they're being cancelled, while Israel's campaign of genocide against Palestinians is reduced to the language of an offensive, a conflict or an occupation. And ethnic cleansing is happening as I speak, and it receives little to no space in our national headlines. While the Daily Mail at the same time writes 29-word headlines about Margot Robbie's postpartum body. They've probably published 4 articles about Abby Chatfield while I've been standing here. In a landmark study undertaken in 2016, Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety reported that in almost 60% of media coverage of violence against women and children, no information about the perpetrator was reported. This hasn't significantly improved in the last decade, and the escalating rates of men's violence against women and children speak to this. This is not to paint every outlet with the same brush, but large parts of our landscape are guilty of obscuring national epidemics of violence and international war crimes on a daily basis. There is an undeniable correlation between the news we consume and our worldviews. If we can understand just how fluidly Andrew Tate's presence in a teenager's algorithm can impact his perception of healthy relationships, consider the impact that Murdoch has had on our collective cultural conscience for decades. It is undeniable that Rupert Murdoch is the conservative mouthpiece for the English-speaking world. Without him, there would be no President Donald Trump. Kevin Rudd put it simply when he declared that Rupert Murdoch is a cancer on democracy. Rudd's petition demanding a royal commission into the Murdoch media is the most signed parliamentary petition in Australian history. In his first term, Prime Minister Albanese ruled out an inquiry into News Corp or media diversity more broadly. Now, a Labor majority government is in a perfect position to take tangible action on the serious issue of media concentration in Australia. The more immediate solution to the spreading of disinformation is to implement enforceable reporting standards with genuine consequences and deterrence measures. Currently, there is no effective framework of accountability for outlets who are willing to publish anything in the pursuit of clicks. Our media regulators do not have the powers required to prosecute these issues meaningfully. This is before we even consider the regulations of giants like Google and Meta. As Margaret Simons pointed out in The Guardian, in every state and federal election since 2010, Rupert Murdoch has endorsed the coalition. Imagine holding that much power in television, print and digital media and losing in a landslide. The people with more impact, or even influence, some might say, than the Murdoch media this election cycle had an iPhone and a clip-on microphone set up in their bedroom. That's the difference between noise and engagement. That's the difference between a country with democratic protections like compulsory preferential voting and one without. While Murdoch has the capacity to drive topics into the public square, his foot soldiers no longer have the ability to curb sentiment. The people cutting through with the public are not those in newsrooms concocting inflammatory headlines. They're people reminding a friend of how voting works in this country and that you don't have to choose between a red or a blue tie. Influencer has been the dirtiest word of this campaign, and I think it's deeply sad that it's been a focal point at all. Peter Dutton ran a campaign on concepts of cultural divides, woke politics, and indoctrination. Influencer is just another part of the manufactured vocabulary of the culture wars. While that word simply means to have influence over a group, we know the Murdoch media has reserved this term for young women. The agenda is clear: to undermine our intelligence, to paint us as untrustworthy, and to conflate us with green juice and a discount code. There is nothing wrong with being an influencer, but the label is intended to cause significant reputational damage. The impact is deeply misogynistic. I've never heard that word associated with a male podcaster, commentator, or businessman. To my knowledge, the same criticism was not levelled at the Batuta Advocate or Mark Bouris for their demeanour, interview style, or lines of questioning. Dim lighting and the branding of honest, blokey conversation is enough for men to be left alone by the public and the media. But for women, it's superficial, dangerous, unprofessional, and a failure. You're just an influencer. Make no mistake, this is personal and territorial from legacy mastheads. During an election campaign where minimal policy vision was on offer, the outlets which turned to the shaming of commentators drove a deliberate attack on political education, engagement, and new kinds of conversations. It was as boring as it was predictable. We were called self-obsessed and self-promoting by the Australian Financial Review, who later endorsed the coalition. The Sydney Morning Herald introduced Millie Rose Bannister, the founder of a mental health charity, as a Lululemon ambassador. The Australian, who's not here today, I believe, ran a range of hit pieces on female content creators right before they massaged the coalition's policies into the nightly bulletin. Interviews with Prime Minister Albanese and former Greens leader Adam Bandt were labelled a warm hug, easy, conversational. I haven't seen Sky's After Dark program ask any politician about the ongoing genocide against Palestinians, reform to negative gearing, or the fact that more than half of the gas exported from our country attracts no royalty payments. These were the questions to which many emerging commentators were asking for answers. It might not be Sarah Ferguson on 7:30, but that isn't the only measure of valid discourse. Letting politicians speak isn't fawning. I believe this is a gendered critique. Just like legacy media, new media exists on a spectrum. Not all reporting, opinion pieces, and interviews are made equal. Quality ebbs and flows. Style and approach changes. A truly diverse media landscape allows audiences to reject tribalism in their consumption and engage with a range of sources offering different perspectives and tones. Instead, these criticisms sought to put every woman podcaster in the same basket: friendly, unserious, and surface level. This generalisation is dangerous. Instead of focusing on the failures of the major parties, instead of pushing for stronger policy platforms and greater outcomes for all Australians, these outlets wanted to sow the seeds of doubt. They wanted to invalidate and undermine a group of powerful young women who have developed the ability to communicate with new audiences in ways that traditional media cannot fathom because they have eroded the trust of their audiences. It is important to recognise that the new media ecosystem in Australia is made up of many exceptional people, most of whom were highlighted during this election campaign were privileged white men and women with platforms like my own. But there are brilliant, diverse voices in this emerging space who are not provided the same coverage or opportunities, and that is worth acknowledging. It's also important to say we are not one homogenous group. We are not one monolithic thing, and different creators represent a diversity of views, theories of change, and approaches to education, commentary, and advocacy. I cannot and do not speak on behalf of new media as a group. My intentions and approach are unique to me. What I do expect is transparency and integrity from the media entities I subscribe to and consume. Here this is from me. I am partisan. I overtly ran a campaign against the coalition. I am happy to confront any line of questioning about that. I will consistently get things wrong, make mistakes, upset people on all sides of politics. But what I refuse to do is allow a microscope to be placed on me and my ring light in my bedroom while the billionaire conservative mouthpiece of the Western world is allowed to run rampant with derogatory, defamatory and hateful content each and every day simply because that's our status quo. This doesn't just go one way. I believe there should be accountability structures for commentators online as well. I welcome guidelines and rules from the Australian Electoral Commission, my favourite place on earth, collaborative posts and engagement with political parties and organisations. We have to have frameworks in place to regulate this kind of work. But regulation should be uniform. Let's force the Murdoch media to do the same. Let's make politicians wear their sponsors on their shirts while they make policy announcements. The Teals are constantly labelled as backed by Climate 200, but the major parties evade having their identity and politics publicly connected to their backers. Content creators are clearly required to label paid partnerships, but we're being scapegoated while Goliath continues his rampage. That notwithstanding, on May 3rd, Australians blatantly rejected the coalition's offer. There are many reasons for that. At the last federal election, I watched our nation explicitly refuse the agenda of Scott Morrison. Between the rise of community independence and the Brisbane Green Slide, our nation rewrote the blueprint for our political arena. A clear message was sent to the two-party system: adapt or die. When the Voice to Parliament referendum was voted down in 2023, two things occurred. The coalition believed they had paved the path to eventual electoral victory, and Anthony Albanese's leadership completely deteriorated. As Stan Grant wrote for the Saturday paper, Albanese's act of political courage in honouring a commitment to the Indigenous voice referendum was betrayed by his failure to prosecute it. Albanese's first term will be remembered as disappointing. The Voice, I believe, broke him. He opted for conservatism and self-protection over confident, progressive governing. Peter Dutton led a No campaign under the slogan, "If you don't know, vote no." His greatest assets politically are apathy, fear and division. They have always been the only tools in his kit. While his confusion and withdrawal were enough to force our nation to reject the generous invitation from First Nations people, Dutton failed to realise that opposition enough is not enough to lead. During this election campaign, the coalition failed to offer policy or positivity. Instead, they led with a contentious and disjointed platform which failed to address the three major issues Australians care about: cost of living, climate and energy, and national security in an increasingly unstable geopolitical environment. When challenged or criticised, Peter Dutton reached back into his limited kit bag and attempted to stoke the flames of the culture wars. People saw through the cards he kept playing, the words woke indoctrination, and the political desperation to drive racism and neo-Nazi rhetoric into the mainstream were also features of his final week demise. Dutton believed Australians were hateful, but our nation's conservatism is more of a scepticism than an extreme. While we remain a country facing significant divides, class, gender, race, and beyond, Dutton's delight in constantly punching down challenged our support for the underdog mentality. Even the campaign slogan, "Let's get Australia back on track," directly points to the problem. The pitch is only enticing if you have a track Australians are interested in getting back on. The Coalition has not answered Australia's call to reform the two-party system. Labor picked up the phone in the last 3 months, and we're waiting to see what they do next. Critiquing the Coalition and the Murdoch media isn't about silencing or censorship or the limitation of freedom of speech. This rebuttal of theirs has always been a false binary. Australians are not oppressing the views of Peter Dutton or his supporters. We are communicating that the Coalition he stands with does not understand the modern Australia they wish to lead. Every reference to Donald Trump throughout the Coalition's campaign only cemented the tombstone of the grave they were digging themselves. As Charlotte Mortlock wrote on Instagram, the average Liberal Party member is a man in his 70s, but the average Australian is a woman aged around 35. 72% of my audience are aged between 25 and 44. 88% are women. The average Cheek follower is quite literally a 35-year-old Australian woman. This is another thing traditional outlets get wrong when reporting on emerging media. We don't just speak to young people who are becoming politically activated for the first time. We attract a huge community of their disenchanted consumers. I have more followers over the age of 55 than under the age of 24. It's an intergenerational community on the rise, not an echo chamber simply for young women. Peter Dutton's refusal to engage with new media platforms, particularly those run by women, was one small, yet huge, decision in a series of reckless refusals to attempt to communicate with the voter base that would eventually end his political career. Meanwhile, Anthony Albanese's campaign ran a clear strategy that humanised him with a voter base that largely felt ignored. Whether you agree with his politics or not, he worked harder to earn each vote. He told women that he was interested at least in speaking to us. It is widely known that Generation Z and millennials were the most powerful voting bloc in this election. I believe this is a strong reason for the record-breaking third-party vote. According to ABC analysis, for the first time since the establishment of the Liberal Party more than 80 years ago, the combined independent and minor party vote is on track to beat a major party. The analysis that I saw published on Saturday showed the Coalition had 32.2% of the primary vote. Minor parties and independents received 33.1%. While Labor's majority emerged stronger than anyone thought possible, it's necessary to remember that this is their second worst primary vote count in history. As the party stares down a supermajority, the question Australians must now ask themselves is, what is standing between the Labor Party and drastic action in their second term? The Murdoch media's iron fist no longer holds the weight it once did. The Conservative Party room looks like they're onto their final rounds of a game of musical chairs. While most progressive Australians sought a Labor minority government that forced action, this outcome leaves no room for excuses. The next 100 days for the Labor Party will communicate whether Albanese is willing to rebuild the progressive identity this working class party once had, or if he will consign Labor to centrist mentalities that have consistently failed our nation. The combative, safe, moderate approach of his first 3 years is not what Australians voted for. The last 3 months of commitments to respect, equality, action and opportunity for all are what led Labor to a historic victory and Peter Dutton's help. These values and messages tie them more closely to community independence and the Greens and the Coalition. And this is where the Senate minor party vote count really matters. The most progressive voting result of all time in the upper house means Labor only ever has to negotiate with the Greens, with the crossbench. If, when and why they turn to the Coalition in the coming term will be vital to watch. There are 3 lasting messages that I believe this election has left for us. First, that the relationship between the Murdoch media and the Coalition will obliterate them both. While it might be easy, quite leisurely in fact, for me to sit back and watch both go up in flames, I wish our nation had competitive major parties with beliefs and opportunities and policies that elevated the offering being made to Australians. Yesterday, the first woman was elected leader of the Liberal Party. Elevating Susan Ley is evidence the party understand the life sentence of irrelevance they are facing. But I will hold my breath to see if their values and platform shifts with this initial performance of reflection and awareness. When it comes to the major players in media, I want to see more of our conglomerates following in the footsteps of independent outlets to work with emerging commentators and creators. This is how we evolve into a flourishing, collaborative environment which takes the best parts of old and new and creates a diversity of higher quality voices in Australia. This could be an exciting prospect of the future if we start to come together. The second point is that nothing stands between the Labor Party and genuinely improving the lives of Australians they seek to represent. 20% student debt cut is one thing, major changes to indexation and the cost of university is a bigger piece of the puzzle. 100,000 new builds for first home buyers does increase supply, but reforming the capital gains tax discount stops the wealthiest 10% of our society treating shelter like a thriving corporate opportunity. A government that is willing to pass a world-first ban on social media for under 16s should also have the fortitude to establish a royal commission into Australia's media concentration, examining not only Murdoch, but the entire industry, including the unregulated space of social media for which I form part. Anthony Albanese has utilised new media as a vehicle to reach voters more directly, and I hope his leadership reflects his campaign strategy. Finally, my message to Australians. Billions of dollars have been spent attempting to divide us, to drive us to extremist ideologies. Entities like Advance Australia ensured your family member's Facebook account was never drive disinformation. Yet most of us saw through it. No amount of money spent on propaganda could drive us to elect hatred, bigotry, and a bloody bad nuclear policy. Voter engagement and literacy has never been higher. Our capacity to have uncomfortable conversations is a direct rebuttal to the tribalism of the United States. It's young Australians who are leading this charge. As we turn away from traditional media and the two-party system, politicians must work harder than ever before to attract our attention and earn our vote. The Labor Party has a lot to prove, but just for a moment, I feel hope that Australia is stepping forward more unified. To have played a personally small role in mobilising progressive action across generations is the greatest honour of my life. While 10-year-old me wanted to be the Prime Minister, the 26-year-old that stands here today recognises that forging an entirely different path and cultivating the passion of Australian women to become politically activated, informed and confident will reshape the future of the political arena in our country. And this is just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. You did it. Our first question is from Women in Media and the National Press Club's Caroline Jones, Young Journalist of the Year winner. Jessica Klein, with special thanks to Bond University for helping fund this award. Your question, Jess.
Hello, I'm Jessica, as you know, regional Queensland journalist with the Toowoomba Chronicle. My question for you, Hannah, is so much has been written since the election about Gen Z and young women in particular. Have we finally entered the time of female influence, or dare I say power?
That's a really nice question. Thank you, Jess, and congratulations. I think we have. And, you know, I think that there is a long way to go in this conversation in the sense that when we're talking about female influence and female power, we can recognise that there is huge machines, corporate machines with agendas that are driving this rhetoric that tries to push us down and ensure that we're not heard and not seen. But I think that the election result points to the fact that our greatest strength is that we're individuals that lead authentically. I think that people are seeing through the spin and the seriousness and the kind of caricature of the media that Murdoch has become. And I think that what influencers represent, ironically, because they try to paint us as the opposite to sort of undermine us, is the fact that when you get in your room with a microphone and an opinion, and when you lead with references to great media outlets, and when you say how you've come to your conclusion, you teach people to stand into their views and stand into that power. And that sort of self-respect, I think, and confidence in our views and the importance of voting, it's been made cool for the first time. And it's a very serious subject that we should take and hold with that level of significance. But I think that young women getting online and saying, you need to care because, you know, if you're not at the table, you're the meal, basically, has made people feel not only that they need to pay attention, but they should be confident in their views and talk about them with their family members because they matter and they're relevant, and it's powerful.
Thank you. Hannah, just before we go to the next question, I've been called many things as a journalist. I've been called an influencer, and worse than that, I've been called a mummy blogger. What would be a better term than social media influencer?
Commentator. I think that, and also, this is not to say that every person online, there are a lot of influencers that have political opinions. That doesn't mean they're a political commentator. There are people that want to share, because I think one of the really special things about Gen Z and millennials and our social media upbringing really is the fact that we encourage each other to share online in intimate and vulnerable ways. And a lot of that is expecting to live our social values and talk about how we're voting, whether it be for the referendum or this election. There's been so much conversation online. And so when we're talking about this, someone making one post saying, I'm voting this way, or encouraging them to use Build a Ballot, which was a tool created by my friend in the room, Lizzie, which was used, I think, more than 600,000 times led to the election. That sort of encouragement doesn't make someone a commentator. They might not want to be one. But for me, my platform was started commentating politically. So to say I'm an influencer, there's nothing wrong with doing a day in the life, but that's not my job and that's not the career path that I've built for myself, so it's incredibly disrespectful. Whereas I think if you want to be an influencer, you're an influencer, but for me, commentator's the word.
Okay, our next question is Shalila Medora from the ABC.
Thank you very much for your address, Hannah. Putting my journalist hat on, you spoke about, a willingness, I suppose, for regulation in the space of online commentary. I won't use influencer, and across the board for potentially even politicians. If regulation, I'd hope that you could reflect on what that regulation might look like, but if regulation were applied to online commentators, how would then they be different from journalists? Yeah,
well, I think that one of the interesting parts of this election was seeing, I know that Abby Chatfield was investigated by AEC, I'm friends with Abby, and one of the questions being asked was, one, did it sort of meet editorial guidelines? Was there creative impact from the politicians being interviewed? That was found that there was not, so it didn't need a political authorisation. But there are people who are doing work with political entities and politicians that need to be authorised. I think one of my concerns is where those authorisations need to sit on a post, how clear and visible they are. But also, I think it comes down to the fact that for me, we shouldn't be collaboratively posting with politicians. I think that that is an endorsement, and even if we can say it's clearly not, I think that the public are fair to be confused by that when consuming Instagram content. For me, I said no to money from multiple political organisations that offered it to me this election cycle, and that was why so much of it was so offensive, because I actively ensured that I was a commentator that was free from everything except my own bias, but I was forthcoming about that. When we look at regulation, I think that there are a lot of tests that need to be put in place, and I'm not an expert in that, but I think in the media landscape there needs to be some sort of fit and proper person test to examine who can own and operate outlets. And I think that at a social media level, there needs to be clear regulations and guidelines when it comes to things like authorisations, endorsements, collaborative posting. And I think a lot of those rules should be clear as to where those need to sit is the first step, the very baseline step.
And how would that make you different from a journalist?
Do you mean if I was to do those things?
Yeah.
Honestly, I wouldn't. And it's still, I don't consider myself a journalist. I see myself as a commentator. I think that if people, and there's a lot of people who were accepting money and, doing authorisations on social media posts, and that did concern me greatly. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of people, there's no truth in political advertising. There's not really that many limitations to who can advertise on different forms of media and what they can say and how they can lie. So what's interesting to me is still, an influencer saying, I'm voting for this person. That seems fair and reasonable to me. When they're getting paid to do that, I think that needs to be very clear from the outset, at the start and the end of the video. It needs to be in the caption, it needs to be on the video and in the caption as well. I think it's the baseline. I don't think those people are journalists.
Next question is Rania Yallop from SBS.
Hey, just a bit about impartiality. Do you think that younger people value impartiality, or do you think now that people expect authenticity, I guess, from the content they're consuming, it's becoming a bit irrelevant? And on that, what do you think we're at risk of losing if more things are not impartial?
Oh my God, we're at risk of losing a lot of things. For one, when I post a video that's an explainer to a particular political topic that has no sort of bias towards, a particular fact or a particular party or candidate, gets no traction. Get no likes, get no views. When I published 10 Things to Know About Peter Dutton, got 1.2 million views in a week. And that's because people are, by the design of our algorithms, becoming more and more inclined to shorter videos that project more inflammatory information. And that's the same as how headlines work in the mainstream media too. The article isn't really read in full. the headline is and the headline shed, right? And so they're very similar in that way. And I think that when we're talking about impartiality, the problem is that we need to regulate algorithms as opposed to putting the blame on the individual. Because again, I'm kind of being scapegoated for every piece of content that I put up, when actually I'd prefer that Meta, I'd prefer that TikTok have regulations in place, have a duty of care, which is something the Prime Minister proposed, as to how those algorithms actually function, and so that they're not by design intended to only reflect back to you your worldview. Because that bias is creating more silos, more culture wars than ever before. So it is worrying to me, and I see it every day in the kind of content I produce. But I do think there's fabulous outlets like the Daily Oz who make every attempt to be objective and down the middle and present to young people like a very centrist viewpoint on different political issues. And they've been probably the most successful youth publication in the country. So I think it does also speak to the fact that there is a level of appreciation and a level of guidance still being provided by objective outlets, even though I personally believe no one's truly objective.
Next question is Sally Pryor from the Canberra Times.
Hannah, hi. Thank you so much for that talk. I am part of the legacy media. I also have very young children, and I find everything you're saying very reassuring. The kids are going to be fine. So what I want to know is, would you ever consider yourself a career in politics?
Oh, I was hoping someone would ask it. No, my intention is to run at the next federal election as an independent senator for New South Wales.
Wow, amazing.
Just on that issue, Hannah, could we ask you what your ideal election result would have been? You kind of got halfway there, but...
Yeah, I think that, I seek to work across the progressive spectrum. Like, I had a great opportunity at the start of this year to come and meet with 17 politicians from Labor, the Greens, and many of the community independents who are known as Teals in Parliament. And because I like talking and engaging with people who are trying to make different kinds of pragmatic, practical change. And so what I wanted was Labor to form a minority government and have to rely on Greens or community independents in order to do that. And that's why I think part of this speech really is, there isn't that threat or that need for negotiation, for the most part, for Labor at the moment. And so what we need to do as a nation now is focus on, okay, if we didn't get the minority government outcome that I know a lot of us were hoping for, then the next step is to say, Labor has not that many obstacles in their way. And they need to be working with the Greens, independents in the Senate, to pass progressive legislation, because that's the policy they want on. So as much as a minority government with those groups would have been my ideal, I think that this is ultimately a net positive for our country, obviously, if you weren't listening. I don't like Peter Dutton. But I think that there's still a huge opportunity here to make change. And I do think that what has happened this election cycle is people are more aware and educated around a preferential voting system than ever before. And I think that will also pay off at the next federal election.
Alrighty. Our next question is Ellen Ransley from The Nightly.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for your speech today. New media has obviously elevated progressive voices like yourself, but it's also led to some more controversial manosphere types. How much do you think that's influenced politics in this country? And do you think there's an onus on the government to kind of crack down on some of the more toxic elements of those conversations?
What's really interesting about the manosphere content, from my perspective, and it might just be my algorithm, but I don't see that many Australian men successfully rising up. There's 2 or 3 that I've been watching. But I think one of the most common sort of questions I'm getting this election cycle is, why are all the content creators in Australia progressive? And in the US, they're conservative, they're far-right men. Joe Rogan Experience, like Charlie Kirk, all these manosphere sort of guys. And I think the reasoning to me seems obvious. In the US, under an optional voting system where really the major parties are the only foreseeable voting choices, and in a media landscape in the US where, yes, Fox is far right, but there are more moderate and left-leaning options like MSNBC, like CNN, that offer a sort of more progressive outlet, the success came because they were able to offer the antidote to that and rise up in this far-right extreme establishment. In Australia, we have the opposite. We have a far-right leaning landscape, and as I say that, there's lots of great journalists in the room from left-leaning and moderate organisations who I appreciate, but we know that the reach is what I'm defining diversity by. When the majority of the eyes are being driven to right-leaning media, the antidote to that has been offered up by progressives. So I think that even though we have manosphere kind of men rising up in Australia, they have nowhere near the followers that the progressive voices have. So I don't see that as a direct threat in this election cycle. I think it's something we're dealing with in an ongoing way. And that requires, again, social media regulation, not just for under 16s. I think we do need to impose a duty of care on these platforms and how they regulate algorithms to provide proactive regulation on that.
Thanks.
Next question is Krishani Danji from The Guardian.
Hi, Hannah. I want to ask you about the Greens. The Greens were very prominent on social media. They tried really hard to speak directly to Gen Z, millennials, content creators such as yourself, Abby Chatfield, as we've spoken about today. Did a lot of sort of content with them or talked about a lot of the policies that they're pushing for. What do you think? Why do you think that didn't necessarily translate to them being able to hold their seats or extend their sort of representation in Parliament? And if I can sort of cheekily add to that, they have their leadership ballot happening tomorrow. Who do you think should lead the Greens next?
Fun, that's a fun question. I like that. So I think, again, and I think this is something that's a misunderstanding. People are seeing the Greens outcome as a failure when there's a more complex conversation to be had. I think one of those more understated conversations is the fact that one of the unique parts of our preferential voting system is that often, and in the last election, the Green slide that occurred in Queensland was largely due to the fact that when in our preferential voting system, we know that really it's a battle between two people, and whoever comes third, their preferences really feed the winner, right? That's how usually it works. That's not a one-size-fits-all. But that's why often when Greens win seats in the House of Reps, it's because likely they're going up against the Liberal candidate in a head-to-head. So often it's the more conservative seats that end up going Green because Labor is likely to feed the Greens. Whereas the quirk currently really is that, I think Max Chandler-Mather and Stephen Bates lost their seat because they were directly head-to-head with the Labor candidate. And while this, I think, is a personal loss because I'm a big fan of both of those men and I'm a big fan of Adam Bandt, I'm really sad to see him go, I think there's a broader conversation about the success of the Greens in the Senate. But I do think that this election is one of stability and centrist mentalities in the fact that people are scared of what they see as, rightly or wrongly, as extremes. Now, I'm a big supporter of the Greens, but I understand that Australians really went for cost of living, central mentality, and who was offering the most loud policies. The media also doesn't give the same attention span to the Greens. It's a complex question, it's a complex answer, and I think there's much more that's going to emerge over coming months about it, and I think Sarah Hanson-Young should be leader of the party.
If I could just sort of add to that, do you think that there's more that could have been done perhaps that would have resulted in, sort of higher primary or more preferences coming to them?
I think what's difficult is that the Greens are carrying stigma and branding baggage that's not fair. Because I think that the Greens are offering much more than climate policy, and what's being projected onto them by the Murdoch media and large parts of conservative Australia is this idea that they're incredibly aggressive and inflammatory, and I don't think that's the case because, as I've said, I'm very much a believer that arguing for dental into Medicare is not a complex or a difficult ask, and Labor can do this as soon as they get into government. So what's tough watching this all unfold is I think a lot of it is misperception because we know that young people vote for the Greens and that's where they're winning on social media. But it is really this baggage of brand that I think is being carried out.
Thank you.
No worries. Hannah, can we talk about the glass cliff and is anyone facing it?
Who's facing the glass cliff right now? Susan Ley. Look, I think this is a really tough one because we haven't really seen much from Susan yet, so I feel like I would be making comment prematurely. But I'm pleased, at the bare minimum, that a party is putting forward a woman when they recognise that they've lost the women vote and they've completely departed from relevance this election. Completely. And I think that's one small step forward. Do I think that Susan Ley represents the majority of women's voices in Australia and that she's an advocate for gender equity? Absolutely not. So when we talk about identity in our politics, putting forward a woman, even if it's performative, I think is one singular step and there's something to celebrate there, but it's limited. I'm really interested to see how the party's policies are shaped by that leadership. What I think is more likely to happen, unfortunately, is that Susan Ley is a temporary placeholder for whoever decides to knock her off in 6 months to 18 months. And I think that's because the Liberal Party won't actually reckon with itself and they will go back to the old ways because they have swung so far to the right, and the moderate voices, the voices that many Australians would have found agreement with, that they now find in the Teals are absent. So I don't see long-term progressive change for the Liberal Party. I don't see an agenda at the next election. I see further death.
But it's important to have a Liberal Party.
I think it's important to have multiple major parties. I don't think it's important to have a Liberal Party.
Next question is Dominic Giannini from AAP.
Thanks, Anna. I just wanted to ask you about regulation that you mentioned before when it comes to social media. So we're seeing a lot more commentators pop up, citizen journalists. A lot of them aren't covered by the same codes or ethics that traditional media would be. The people that commentate in traditional media, like Murdoch, can be brought to like ACMA and stuff. So how do you see everyone being captured under the same umbrella, which then leads to the question, what is a commentator? How would you define it? Like, my 100 Twitter followers might not make me a commentator if I decide to post, whereas yours might.
Yeah, I think that there's not an umbrella for regulation because they're different spaces and different roles. But I think there could. I think that it's possible in the sense that, you know, I see myself as closer to like a talkback radio presenter who, you know, explains the news of the day, but ultimately runs on and builds audiences through opinion and through a debate they're having with their audience, and they're constantly in a feedback loop with. And I think that's the success of social media creators. While radio dies, we grow. That's kind of an interesting relationship, I think, that's occurring right now. When it comes to regulation, one of the things I think constantly is people keep coming to me with this code of ethics. Have we been reading the papers in this country? I don't know what code of ethics people are talking about, because, you know, we've got a media regulator who doesn't really have the powers to actually facilitate meaningful change and prosecute it, right? So often when there is something sent to the media regulator, it takes months to investigate, it's a slap on the wrist, it's a small fine that means nothing to these outlets. So when we talk about journalistic codes of ethics, there are brilliant journalists in this room, many of whom have asked questions today, and I'm so thankful for the work that you do. But I also think that within your own industry, surely you all recognise that there are so many people that don't abide by a code of ethics, and that editors help and actually amplify the information that's happening through headlines, through subheadlines, through the content that's being drip-fed to us and is deeply manipulative. So to me, to that I say, I want there to be a code of ethics that governs us all. I'm not sure if it is a one-size-fits-all thing, and I think there should be things like I mentioned before, like a fit and proper person test. It's who can own and operate media. When it comes to commentary and social media, again, I think it's about regulating disinformation and misinformation online and how our algorithms operate and feed us.
Thanks.
Next question is Erin Cross from Her Canberra.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you for that powerful speech. As someone who is your age, my question is, how do you keep hope alive within yourself that our generation will implement impactful change when it's just so easy to look at the world and feel dejected?
I think social media can be the worst for that too, in that, you know, every time I open my phone, I feel more anxious, I feel more down. I constantly, like even today, I've decided that after this speech, I have to put my phone on airplane mode for 6 hours because I don't want to look at comment sections and I don't want to be kind of engaged with what may or may not be said. Because criticism is valid and we need to have tough conversations and we need to disagree and sort of reshape the public square. But we currently exist in an exhausting political landscape globally, and it's really easy to just want to, you know, there's a very enticing pool of apathy, and there's a willingness to just say, I'm going to unfollow these news things after the election, I don't have to engage, I'm just going to do my day-to-day, especially in a cost of living crisis too. Like, we're all working really hard and there's a lot of fatigue around. But to me, I think actually, like, people were like, you must be exhausted after the election. That's my Super Bowl. The amount of young women who would come up to me in the street and be like, I voted. Like, no one used to care about voting. It's so uncool. Like, when I was 10, I was the biggest nerd in my class about this electoral commission thing. My parents bullied me endlessly about it. And now it's the coolest thing in the world to have got your ballot ready for voting day on Build a Ballot and go in and talk to your friends about it. I have Good Morning to Everyone Except Peter Dutton shirts that I sold 5,000 of. Like, people really cared. People were excited. And most of that was young women who found values alignment and community in talking about issues that matter to us. When we have respectful and empathetic dialogue with each other, we're able to bridge that gap that's occurring between generations, between cultures, between genders. And it's a struggle, and we're in an incredibly toxic environment at the moment. But the fact that I've been able to build a career trying to instill hope in women my age and much older and much younger has shown me that there is so much appetite for hope right now. We need it more than ever. And so I just feel really inspired to continue on after this election and hopefully just to build on that for the next one.
Thank you.
Hannah, how do you have hope when you look at Donald Trump?
For God's sake, Emma.
No, actually, seriously.
No, I'm thinking. I'm very sweaty too. It's actually a really hard question. And the reason it's a hard question is because when the US election day arrived and I sat on the couch with my friends and we actually just cried, it was so difficult. And the next day I woke up and thought it was a nightmare, you know, that this was happening. To believe that, you know, one of the most powerful countries in the world that, you know, not half of their voting population, but about a third of their voting population actually voted for him, considering people who didn't bother. When you think about the fact that hundreds of millions of people chose that over a candidate that was competent, to me, was just so difficult to overcome, because as a young woman looking at someone accused so many times of sexual violence and of so many more things, it's so hard to reckon with the fact that people are willing to look past the basic human rights of so many groups. But in sitting with that rage that I felt, I knew that I ultimately wasn't going to be able to continue if I only allowed the rage to define my emotional state. And so for me, when Donald Trump was elected, it was an opportunity to say that won't happen here next year. That day I made a post that said that will not happen here next year, and that drove me. So Donald Trump, if anything, Canada's result, Australia's result, the UK's result in many ways, that was driven by the fear, and there was a global swing to the right. And the world has watched and said, we don't want that. And so Donald Trump is awful, and there's not really much hope there, but the only hope I can find is that we rejected that, and that's powerful.
Thank you. Next question is Daniel Said from Crikey.
Hi, Hannah. I want to talk about your run again, but you mentioned in a recent Gruen social clip that your slogan would be not pale, stale or male.
Correct. That was supposed to be funny, but that's not my actual slogan. Thank you for asking the curly question, though.
And I guess we're here sort of with Women in Media, who's sort of, I guess, relationship with its own diversity has sort of been highlighted over the last few months. Is there a limit to sort of leveraging identity politics for you, in your view?
I think one of the first things to say is that I'm one of the most privileged people in Australia. I am a tertiary educated white woman who was supported, financially through university. And again, as I said, the voices that were elevated during the election campaign were the voices of young white men and women like myself. And that I want to see more of my peers who are far more diverse than me up here and taking these opportunities. So it's important to recognise that. And I think that, there hasn't been that much space carved out for young women, but also a range of minority voices in Australian media. We know that's an ongoing problem, and in Australian politics. In saying that, the Trump rhetoric that we're seeing right now, there's sort of Peter Dutton's refusal to engage with women at all, means that women spoke up and said, no, there's nothing for us here. You're offering nothing to us and you don't even want to speak to us. You have no vision. And so I think that there is a limitation on identity politics, and it's incredibly important for me to recognise my privilege. I am not that different to a white man. I see my role. I'm 6'2" as well. There's many advantages to the life that I live. Men in elevators are terrified of me. It's fantastic. But I think acknowledging that and speaking to that and saying, my privilege is something that I should then use to try and advocate for further change. And I will make mistakes in that all of the time, but I can't let my identity define too heavily anything about me. I have to acknowledge, be forthcoming about it, and then use the privilege I have to try and make space and carve out conversations that also help others step into that political advocacy, into that engagement, into that conversation as well.
Thank you. Next question is Michelle Ainsworth from the ABC.
Hi, Hannah. A question from a fellow nerd who in Year 10 came to Canberra and sat in the Parliament and named the front bench of... to the great horror of my friends. But my pathway did take me to the press gallery for a very, very long time. My question to you is, you've been very transparent about your political views, but there is often not a lot of, and this is a criticism of the press gallery that I was once part of, that there is often not a lot of transparency from our nation's political reporting. We refer to unnamed sources who clearly have their own agendas. What changes would you like to see come from the press gallery out of this election and reporting?
I actually think, when it comes to the ABC, obviously, I'm a massive fan. I think they're one of the best broadcasts in the country, if not the best. What I more care about is that in the press gallery particularly, there is an elitist culture. When I went to the budget lockup, the response to that was horrendous. People just trying to make different kinds of content and engage in new ways with audiences that don't know anything about politics was met with this complete elitism and rejection. And that's not from every outlet or every journo. But I think that there is, guidelines to be changed. I think there should be sort of enforceable standards. I think when it comes to unnamed sources, I'm less concerned by that, even though I know backgrounding and things for politicians is really just factional warring and party warring, and it's quite embarrassing to watch. But I don't really have an eye on changing that. I don't think that's my first step. The thing that I really want to see is enforceable reporting guidelines and standards for things like how we report about domestic and family violence. I think that there's huge changes that need to be made in terms of how we identify who the perpetrator or the charged person of a crime is, to ensure that we're not minimising or obscuring the realities of who commits crime in this country, because I think that, domestic and family violence is the primary issue for me, and sexual violence, because so often we centre the murdered woman and or make it impossible, like dating app death, footy star charged. The crime has been reduced, the person has been made invisible, and we don't actually recognise the harm that causes and the way it actually elevates the problem, because it allows men who commit violence against women to not understand or recognise the epidemic or see themselves as going to be ever held accountable. So I'm less concerned with politicians on background. I'm more concerned with like enforceable guidelines around these sorts of issues.
Next question is Nick Stewart from Ability News.
Hi, going back to the old media, or the media of old white men who are balding, whoever they might be. I was wondering, you eviscerated the Australian and the Murdoch media. Why is it that young people, haven't turned to the Nine Network or other alternatives? Why are they turning instead to bloggers? Is it the content that you're providing that's radically different and quite different? Or is it rather that the new medium, the internet, privileges exactly what you're producing?
I think it's partly social media. I think that's a huge part of the answer. Like, I haven't watched free-to-air TV in years. I might have been 10 the last time I watched it, if I'm being honest. I'll watch this later on. Watched it on YouTube many times, got to get the views up. But I think when we're talking about the relevance of media, it's the need to meet young people where we're at, right? And I think like outlets like the Daily Oz, I think that's one of their headlines, one of their slogans, because they founded a social media platform, they have a newsletter, they have a podcast. I think that major outlets, I'm not sure if I'm wrong on this, but I'm sure they find more traction with younger generations on their social media platforms and through their podcasting opportunities. Because I think that is one of the most viable and powerful messages that you can send, because we have less time in our day-to-day, and we, in a cost of living crisis too, like I know less and less people that even own a TV, frankly, and turn it on. So when we're talking about reaching young people too, turning on the nightly news and seeing a man in a suit read it in a very serious voice just isn't authentic to young people anymore either. So I think there's been attempts, like, remember when the project was started and that was the young hip thing? It's not anymore. It's, it's barely moderate now, and I don't think they're reaching young people. They are for Gen X now. Sorry, Gen X, for saying it like that. But I think it's about this, they sort of create something interesting, but then they allow it to die out and don't continue to adapt to the new landscape. And I'm sure in 10 years, I'll be the same. I'll be in the corner saying these young people don't like me anymore. And that'll be a bridge I'll have to cross at the time. But I think mostly it's about needing to meet people where they're at. And currently podcasting and social media is the forum for that.
I'm with you. Let's get stuck into Gen X.
Next question is Julie Hare.
Thanks, Hannah. It was a great speech. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review, otherwise known as Legacy Media. So you mentioned before criticism in the masthead media around the budget lockup. I'm just wondering whether it was worth it from your perspective. Was there any value in it, and will you be putting your hand up to go again? Yes, you won't be, but in the Senate by then.
No. I would love to go to another budget. Yeah. And I think that one of the easy misconceptions that Legacy Media had with our role there was we're not claiming to publish something equivalent to the Financial Review. That's not what people want from us. And frankly, people aren't reading it from you either, sorry. The audience we're trying to reach, hey, my dig is not at you, personally. Again, I identify that there's not that many options in this country as to which outlet you work for, so I never have a go at individual journalists. But when we're talking about reaching people and what we're trying to communicate, the people we're talking to don't know what a budget is. They really don't know who Jim Chalmers is, genuinely. So while the press gallery and they are in the lockup taking it very seriously, and I agree that there's an incredible role for that, the people who follow me who go, I don't know who the treasurer is and I don't know what the budget looks like or what's in it for me, they don't want me to provide deep financial analysis. They want to understand the mechanics of what a lockup is, what a budget looks like, what are the top 10 items, what does this mean for the election? And those are questions we can answer and have a discussion about. So I think understanding that and then recognising that's our role there to play is to go in and make politics fun and accessible and entertaining and digestible. If that's the goal, it's not a very threatening goal to you, because we're working on different things, and that's why I'm talking about this idea of actually, there's incredible outlets like The Guardian's talked to me about like, okay, would you come on the podcast? We're going to cut this reel down. There's an opportunity to work together to actually have conversations across the table between commentators and like media outlets, whether it be indie or legacy media or whatever it is, and try to make that change and bridge that divide, which provides mutual benefit. But I think it's the misconception of what we're out to do, because the intent is to provide something completely different to you.
Thank you so much.
Next question, Sarah Rudd.
Thanks, Hannah. Evelyn Manfield from ABC News. That's
Sorry.
Okay. You said in your speech that it concerns you greatly that some influencers accepted, or content creators accepted, money for content that they made during the election. How frustrating was that for you as someone who didn't accept that money, and do you think it damaged the broader trust that audiences have with content creators, commentators like yourself?
I think when it's declared clearly, it's okay. I think the issue is how we're being lumped together and how we're seen as one sort of conglomerate. Because if there's someone who is there to endorse, Climate 200, if there's something, if there is someone there to endorse a Teal Independent or a Community Independent, and they're clearly declaring that, and they're clearly declaring that they've been paid, I think that's for followers to decide as long as it's visible on the post. But for me, it is frustrating only because, for example, some creators were paid or supported to attend the budget lockup, and I said no because I have personal guidelines and boundaries as to what I accept and what I engage with. So what was frustrating then was for the mainstream media to report that I had been paid to be there, which was not factual or correct but hadn't been checked with me. The lumping is my concern, not the individuals, because I think that there can be people operating in different spaces, but the idea that influencers is an umbrella term that applies to me and someone who's, being paid by the Greens or a particular candidate when I refuse to do that, that's my concern, because it delegitimises me in the process, and that's not fair for my audience or people I'm trying to engage for the first time either.
Thank you. Would you run for the Greens or just as an independent?
Just as an independent.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question is more for the Gen Z of it all. On your podcast, you talked about Peter Dutton's TikTok nickname, Peggy Sue.
Didn't expect that today, actually.
Throughout the campaign, do you think he knows that he was the butt of a joke amongst women under the age of 30? And do you think moving forward, the major parties are capable of producing leaders that are even sensible options for those women under the age of 30?
Different questions. The first question, we talked about the Peggy Sue story because it was such a pop culture moment, and that's part of the podcast that I'd run. It's half news, half pop culture. And it was really funny to see that integration and see how young women were kind of engaging in that public square and driving caricatures of politicians. But if I'm being honest, I find it incredibly uncomfortable that that was something that was leveraged against him. I know I've been incredibly critical of Peter Dutton and I don't hold back my feelings, but I do have an issue with what that essentially was sexual shaming of someone who's never been identified. It's actually arguably, I don't think it's defamatory, but arguably it could be. I think he didn't run that argument because you don't want to run a legal case during a campaign, you don't want to draw more attention to the fact. But personally, I didn't like that was associated with him, and I thought it was deeply unfair, if I'm being honest, but that's not really a popular opinion to have in the space that I operate in. So I didn't say it. Second to that, I think when it comes to the major parties, we aren't going to see a truly progressive leader, because when we're talking about women under the age of 35 particularly, we're talking about progressive views for the large part. I don't think we're going to see a truly progressive leader that works to the level that we want to affect drastic change in the coming 10 to 15 years. But I think there are some brilliant people in Parliament who do that.
Amazing. Thank you.
While Shalila's coming to the microphone, quotas for the Liberal Party, yes or no?
Absolutely, they need them. They need them.
Okay, thank you. And the final question, Shalila Medora.
Hi, Megan. I just wanted to ask you, obviously you're considering or are planning to run for Parliament. In the last election, we saw actually massive numbers of young people, more diverse people than we've ever seen before, entering Parliament. How important is it to be what you see? How important do you think it is to have candidates or to have people representing parties who look, sound and act like you?
A large part of the reason I want to run is not because I think I would win. And I don't say that, on a false sense of, I don't know what will happen. Running for the Senate as an indie is virtually impossible. In New South Wales, you'd have to get 400 to 500,000 votes to get the required numbers. That's a tough ask. Press Club, everyone watching at home, remember me in 3 years. But I think that part of the reason I'm so desperate to do it is because I've spent 4 years now on the outside talking about politicians and criticising and offering support, but constantly negotiating my progressive line and where my boundaries and personal values lie. And that is all well and good, but I also want to step into the arena and actually understand and challenge that system, because I think that's the next point of affecting change for me ultimately. But running a campaign and losing, I think, is also a powerful thing to do to show other young women that they can do the same thing and that it's not embarrassing. It's actually a triumph that you attempted to challenge a system and an establishment. So I think it has to be that we see it as an opportunity to have more conversations about what that looks like, what it takes, what it costs, who you get involved, how you get a volunteer base, you know. When having these conversations politically, it can often be hard to find one candidate or one party that represents all of your views. And I don't expect people to align with me. I expect a lot of criticism and constant negotiation and compromise. But I want to try my best to sort of walk the walk, you know. And I think running is that next step for me. And I want to show young women that they can run, they can fail, they can succeed. Whatever happens, I want to share that with them the whole way. And that's, I think, why I've been able to build the platform that I have, because most of the people that follow me feel like they have a friendship with me in some way.
Final question. You're almost done.
Oh,
Morris.
Yes, finally.
As a future politician, you're not going very well because you answered 18 questions, which is not the norm. So, but thank you for taking all those questions. My question is the business. You know, media as businesses are under pressure, so I'm worried. I'd like to tell us about cheap media. Are you making money? Will it make money? You know, how are you going to make your fortune?
I run an incredibly profitable business. And that's because it is just me, and then I have 2 part-time workers, one who is in the room with me today. I have 2 university students who work with me part-time to help me with research, to help me with social media content, because I'm the old girl in the office now. I need some help with the Gen Zs. I think that, you know, I'm earning a comfortable living, but for the first year of running Cheek full-time, I lived off, I think, $30,000 that I had from a book advance. They give $30,000 in the hand, and I had no money. And in the last year, I've been able to grow the platform so significantly that I now have between 7 and 10 revenue streams. And that's between things like subscription model, I sell a vibrator, to be completely honest. I've gone on a live national tour. I've written 2 books. I have, you know, paid partnerships on the podcast, on Grid, on social media. I think it's really incredible that there are so many companies in this country that are willing to support the views of progressive, loud, honest young women. So I'm incredibly proud to do the work that I do and work with the companies that I'm able to partner with. But I do have a profitable media business in this country, which is quite rare.
Thanks for coming for free.